the Globe and Mail wrote an editorial apologizing to its readers, saying that this had never happened in the history of the newspaper, and that steps have been taken, that this would never happen again. Last month, April the 1st, fell on another Sunday. If you've been following the story of the Republican primaries, you know that Willard Romney, known as Mitt, years ago drove with his family to Canada with their Irish setter Seamus tied to the roof of the car. Gail Collins, who I think is the best columnist writing for the New York Times, has made it her life to talk about the dog tied to the roof of the car. And they stopped at a gas station. The dog had an accident. They had to hose down the car. It was... So I called my friend the actor again. And I said, this time you're Mitt Romney. And I wrote a script. And what we did, he has a home, not the actor, but the governor has a home in New Hampshire, and we phoned, and I said, we've reached Mitt Romney's home. Governor, good morning. And one of my producers, named Marjorie Nicola, said, no, this is Ann Romney, but the governor is anxious to talk to you. And that set up the thing. So I began to talk to him about the economy and unemployment, what he would do in the White House, and does he think that President Obama is a socialist, and so on. And then I said, I want to talk about the dog. And he got very angry and said, I don't know why you people want to talk about the dog. I love that dog, and he died, and we have a new dog. And we went on, and then he said, we love Canada. They got trees. They got big trees. And get off the dog, will you? Get off the... And I said, Governor, thanks very much. All the best. Well, the thing exploded again. We had over 300, I think about 400 emails, many of them very critical of me because I had insulted the putative next president of the United States. Somebody sent a letter in saying that thought it was a plot by Stephen Harper to destroy the CBC. So the point is that people will believe if we set a context. The sad thing is, quite often we get those contexts wrong. The facts are wrong, the context is wrong, the assertions are unverifiable. We use anonymous sources. I don't know why. If we let people talk off the record, I don't know why we allow that. We have a sense that we don't need to check facts anymore. Magazines still have fact checkers, newspapers don't, never did. With the result is we get a lot of things wrong. When I was at the Globe, they used to have a regular feature called Our Mistake. And the worst thing for a young reporter was to have one of your stories mentioned in Our Mistake. And fortunately, I never did that. But we would explain what we had said, and we would explain why it was wrong. It worked very well until one day there was a mistake in the Our Mistake column, and they killed it. One of the reasons for, it's not malice on the part of journalists. I think it's laziness, and I think it's incompetence. In the last 3 years in the US, there have been 15,000 reporters, journalists, laid off. In Canada, it's about 2,000. And the largest category of those layoffs is editors. Things are not edited the way they were. Pardon me. And this is all due to cutbacks. We've recently received cutbacks, a 10% cut to CBC. I'm not making any special pleading here. Other departments have, and other people will be laid off as well as us. But what happens when that happens, when the money disappears, in a sense, We have to shrink the mandate of journalism. Every poll has shown since 9/11 that people are desperate for foreign news. They want to know what's going on in the world, because what's going on in the world will at some point impact their lives. And at the very point where the appetite is increasing, we're cutting back. Newspapers are closing bureaus. CBC is closing its Africa Bureau and its Latin American Bureau. Sadly, those resources, I think, are being transferred to London to do the Olympics. I don't know if the bureaus will be reopened afterwards. That's a serious situation. It also reflects itself in the lack of money for investigative reporting. Investigative reporting, there are two elements. It takes a hell of a long time, and it's very expensive. And at the end of the process, you may not have a story. Now, the Toronto Star in this town is spending enormous amounts of money on investigative reporting. The whole orange helicopter thing is amazing. The Fifth Estate does it on television, but we do it less. And when our owners say, well, you have to do more with less, the fact is you do less with less. We don't have the resources to do what we want to do. So the result is that quite often we revert to things that are cheap, easy, and fast. Celebrity journalism, for example. Gossip journalism. I do a thing once a year. Pardon me, I go through the tabloids, the supermarket tabs, and I compile a list of celebrities that no one's ever heard of. And then I broadcast them. And literally, people do not know who these people are, but they're involved in extraordinary drug things or marriage or whatever. And I think it's fascinating. There's this interest in people no one's ever heard of. David Halberstam, the late David Halberstam, who was a fabulous correspondent for the New York Times, said it's inauthentic people, inauthentic journalists writing about inauthentic people. But yet we do it over and over again. And we put it on our websites, and CBC does it. All of the things I'm saying applies to CBC as well as other media. The errors, I think, errors of fact are one thing. Errors of context are something else indeed. Errors of context can be not only misleading but dangerous. I'll give you an example. I covered the so-called Troubles in Northern Ireland. Troubles is a euphemism for what was going on there. It was wholesale murder between the Catholics of Falls Road and the Protestants of the Shank Hill. I went back for the Good Friday peace negotiations in 1995, I think. And I went over to the old neighborhoods. Now, the British were still there. And the troops, the Green Jackets, had a tank-like thing. It was an armored personnel carrier. It was called the Pig. And it would travel around these streets and try and maintain peace and order. And I was in one area, and the kids were playing soccer and so on. And the Pig showed up, and the kids were kicking the ball. And a BBC crew showed up and turned the lights on. As soon as the lights went on, the kids who were playing soccer began to throw stones at the APC. And the troops, looked around, the turret went around, the kids were throwing rocks. And then the Beeb turned off the cameras, and the kids stopped throwing stones and went back to playing soccer. But that night on English television, I'm sure there was a story about young Belfast Catholics or Protestants, I don't know who it was, throwing stones at our troops in the heart of Belfast. That is an example of a tortured context that deceives the viewer, listener, reader. And I think that that's difficult. Journalism should at some point try and reclaim history, try and get the story right. Lewis Lapham, who was a wonderful magazine writer, essayist, said, history is not what happened 200 years ago or 2,000 years ago. History is the story of what happened 200 years ago or 2,000 years ago. And I think it's the job of journalists to reclaim that. So how do we do it? Well, there's an institution called the Pew Institute in the States, which monitors the rights and wrongs and sins of journalism. And they've come up with 9 principles. And I'll just read them. And as I read them, just ask yourself if you think your media are living up to those principles. Pardon me. Number 1, the first obligation of journalism is to truth, which means reliable, accurate facts in meaningful context. Well, given the incidents of plagiarism, false information, laziness, and the Today Show edited some tape last week of the Zimmerman guy, the guy who shot Trayvon Martin, the young boy in Florida. And they edited the tape to the point where it sounded like Zimmerman was saying, he's black, so I'm going to shoot him. That was not the case. They fired the producer, but they didn't apologize on air. They refused to go on air and say, we were wrong and we shouldn't have done it. I'd give media 65 to 70% in terms of the obligation to truth. The second principle is the first loyalty of journalism should be to its citizens. However, we live in a media-concentrated world where there are boards of directors, shareholders, regulators, and that loyalty becomes diffuse. Sometimes it becomes lost. Third, the essence of journalism is a discipline of verification more than a single source, and so on. Well, I've told you it's very hard to live up to that particular principle now in an age of reduced resources.